Everyone knows Princess Caroline of Monaco, the glamorous royal, the fashion icon, the eldest child of Grace Kelly. But nobody knew the real Caroline. The baby born to secure a kingdom before she could open her eyes. The 21-year-old whose new husband sold her honeymoon photos. The widow who returned from Paris in black at 33. At 68, Caroline carries a story Monaco rarely tells. Not just about her mother's crash in 1982, not just about the boat that killed her husband in 1990, but about the death threats he received before that race. Is it hard always to be nice? Terrible. You wake up every morning wanting to be nice, so it's difficult. The marriage that ended in a psychiatric ward, and the loss that came just months ago. The birth of a pawn. Caroline was born on January 23, 1957, inside the Prince's Palace of Monaco. Not in a hospital. Right there in the royal apartments where even her first breath carried weight far beyond family joy. From the very start, she was treated as more than a baby. She was Monaco's future because of the 1918 Franco-Monégasque Treaty. The question of an heir was political. If Monaco had no clear successor, France could absorb the tiny principality. So when Caroline was born, doctors were there. But so were legal concerns, and the quiet fear of what might happen if the line failed. The moment she entered the world, she was registered as hereditary princess. Before she could even understand light, her life had been tied to the survival of a country. Newspapers across Europe did not report her birth like a normal royal announcement. They treated it like a constitutional event. The palace issued an official bulletin with the exact time of her birth, 4:15 in the afternoon, so the order of succession could be formally recorded without delay. In that instant, Caroline became a public figure before she had ever been a private person. Still, even that title came with uncertainty. From day one, she was heir presumptive, not heir absolute. A younger brother would outrank an older sister, so even while she was presented as Monaco's future, her position was fragile. Every tutor, court official, and royal doctor looked at her through that lens. She was the child meant to hold the line unless a boy arrived and changed everything. The cold palace. Her mother, Grace Kelly, had given up a life most people could only dream about. Before marrying Prince Rainier III in 1956, she was one of the most famous actresses in the world. She walked away from all of it. By the time Caroline was born, Grace had stopped acting. She smiled for cameras and looked perfect in public. But people close to her later said that in private she mourned what she had lost. Friends said she sometimes watched her old films in the palace cinema, not simply to revisit the past, but to remember who she had once been. Around Caroline, she was no longer Grace Kelly the actress. She was Her Serene Highness. Duties came first. Appearances mattered. The palace was beautiful but strict, and that strictness shaped the family's emotional tone. Caroline grew up with a mother who loved her, but who also seemed trapped inside a role she had not fully chosen. Her father, Prince Rainier III, brought his own pressure. He ran Monaco like a businessman building an empire. Tourism, hotels, casinos. His days were packed with meetings and state matters. Staff described the palace as a place where work came before warmth. Rainier could spend 12 hours on duty and still be signing papers late into the night. In that world, there was little space for easy affection. Behind polished photos, daily life was much colder. Courtiers said Rainier and Grace often ate on different schedules or in separate rooms. The children dined apart from their parents. For Caroline, some of her earliest memories were not about being cuddled. They were about being arranged, presented, and watched. Palace etiquette required children to dine separately until they were old enough to behave properly at the main table. In Caroline's case, that separation lasted until she was around 14. So while diplomats sat with her parents in glittering rooms, she sat with silver cutlery laid out perfectly, surrounded by service, but not by warmth. The shift that changed everything. Then, before she was even old enough to understand, the one role that had defined her birth changed. On March 14, 1958, her younger brother Albert was born. Male. Under Monaco's succession rules, that changed everything immediately. Caroline was no longer the future ruler. She went from national insurance policy to second place before she could even say mother or father. Duty stayed, pressure stayed, but certainty did not. Caroline later summed up her childhood with a simple sentence: what she had to do always came before what she wanted to do. That was the system she grew up inside. Her father wanted disciplined children ready for royal life. From age 5 or 6, her days filled with protocol, appearances, and rules. Even little choices, clothes, friends, behavior, were filtered through one question: what looks right for Monaco? Because her parents were so distant, the person she leaned on most was her nanny, Maureen. Caroline and Albert became deeply attached to her. When Maureen went on vacation, both children cried so hard that Grace had to call her back early. Caroline later admitted she did not even eat dinner in the same room as her parents until she was 14. So, while the world saw Grace Kelly as the glamorous mother of a fairy tale palace, Caroline often experienced her as someone far away. Maureen was the emotional center of her early life. The party princess paradox. By the late 1970s, Caroline had become one of the most photographed young women in Europe. Magazine covers multiplied. Paparazzi followed her across Paris. Fashion houses wanted her in their clothes. The girl raised inside duty had become a symbol of glamour. But the problem was that nothing stayed private. Her social life swallowed her academic life in the public imagination. Even though she had earned her French baccalaureate with high honors, excelling in philosophy, teachers praised her work. But the press barely cared. They mentioned her grades briefly, then rushed back to nightclub photos. Over time, that mismatch flattened her into a party princess. Her parents tried to control that image, and in doing so, they drove her further away. Palace statements were released. Safe appearances were arranged. The harder the palace tried to shape her, the more she pushed back. She skipped engagements. Every act of rebellion fed the cameras more. The first husband's betrayal. Then came Philippe Junot. Caroline was 21 when she married him in 1978. He was 38 to 17 years older, a French businessman with a reputation for nightlife, charm, and instability. Exactly the kind of man her parents feared. Grace, according to later accounts, was deeply distressed and did not believe the marriage would last. So even on the wedding day, dread sat beneath the ceremony. What made it worse was betrayal. Junot reportedly brought a photographer friend along on the honeymoon, and private images of Caroline soon found their way into tabloids. Photos that should have remained personal became front-page material. The woman who had spent her whole life being watched now found that the man closest to her could also turn her into content. By October 1980, just over 2 years after the wedding, they were divorced. Caroline was only 23. The great love and the terrible price. When Caroline met Stefano Casiraghi, her life was already full of cracks. Her mother, Grace Kelly, had died in the tragic car crash of September 14, 1982. That loss still hung over everything. Stefano was 23, Italian, handsome, confident, and warm in a way that made Caroline feel safe. For Caroline, who had grown up inside duty and ceremony, this felt like fresh air. Friends called it love at first sight. Caroline herself would later say, "I had my fairy tale. We both knew it." They married on December 29, 1983. Over the next 3 years, they had 3 children: Andrea, Charlotte, and Pierre. For once, the Grimaldi household looked joyful. Stefano became the emotional anchor Caroline badly needed. He protected her privacy, balanced her quiet reserve with his livelier spirit, and won over Prince Rainier completely. But Stefano's great passion was offshore powerboat racing, and Caroline never liked how dangerous it was. In 1989, he won the World Class 1 title. Then, in 1990, he returned to defend it. Just weeks before the final race, there had already been a frightening explosion off Guernsey. He survived, but the warning was there. Then came October 3, 1990. Off Monaco's coast, the sea turned against him. His boat slammed into heavy waves and flipped violently in seconds. Stefano was trapped and killed instantly. He was only 30 years old. Caroline was in Paris when it happened. When she rushed back, she returned, dressed in black, now a widow with 3 tiny children. Andrea was 6, Charlotte was 4, Pierre was 3. There was a bitter final twist. He had reportedly planned to retire after that race. Even darker friends claimed Stefano had received death threats in the days before the crash. There was talk of a bulletproof car and fears about dangerous business circles. Police looked into sabotage, but ruled it an accident. That official answer closed the case, but it could not quiet the feeling that something about the loss was almost too cruel to bear. After that, Caroline disappeared from the spotlight. She left Monaco and retreated to a quiet village in France, far from the water that now seemed haunted. She never spoke openly about what that pain felt like, but those around her understood that she had suffered 2 life-breaking losses before turning 34. The marriage that unraveled. In the mid-1990s, rumors spread across Europe that Prince Ernst August of Hanover was involved with Caroline. The gossip caught fire because he was still married, and his wife had once been close to Caroline. By 1997, Ernst filed for divorce. On Caroline's 42nd birthday in 1999, they held a civil wedding. But the marriage soured. Ernst became known for public outbursts, violent behavior, and repeated humiliation. There were incidents of shouting, threats, aggression, and a widely covered psychiatric ward episode after one especially alarming breakdown. Caroline often found herself trapped between preserving dignity in public and dealing with chaos in private. In 2005, another crushing blow came. Prince Rainier III died. Caroline buried her father and somehow kept standing. By 2009, reports surfaced that Caroline had discovered Ernst with another woman. After that, she left and never truly lived with him again. Legally, they remained married, but in practice, the relationship ended. The recent losses that keep coming. Time keeps bringing fresh reminders of the life she once built with Stefano. In December 2024, Fernando Casiraghi, Stefano's mother, died at 99. Caroline attended the funeral with Andrea, Charlotte, and Pierre. More than 3 decades after Stefano's death, the bond with his family still held. Then came January 8, 2026. Philippe Junot, her first husband, died in Madrid at 85. His daughter announced he passed peacefully, surrounded by family after what she called a long, beautiful, adventurous life. For Caroline, it must have felt like the closing of a very old door. The man who threw her young life into scandal in the late 1970s was finally gone. Just weeks later, on February 14, 2026, Princess Charlene of Monaco suffered a major health setback, forcing her to withdraw from the annual Rose Ball, an event Caroline herself had once presided over for decades. Once again, at 68, Caroline stepped into the breach. She accompanied Prince Albert at the ball, offering the quiet, steady presence that Monaco has come to depend on. And on March 30, 2026, Caroline attended the funeral of her longtime friend, French fashion designer Hubert de Givenchy's last protégé, in Paris. She was photographed leaving the church alone, dressed in black, her face a mask of composure that has defined her for 6 decades. The legacy that survives? That is not the whole story of her later years. There is another side to Caroline that survived everything. The side that kept creating, protecting, and building. She stayed at the center of the Ballet de Monte Carlo, which marked its 40th anniversary in 2025. In December 2025, she and Prince Albert opened the Médiathèque Caroline, a public library and cultural center, another quiet sign that she had chosen to leave behind not only sorrow but institutions that would outlast sorrow. Her children have spoken about that legacy. Charlotte once reflected that sad events happen to everyone, even if they arrive early and leave deep marks. She spoke of the existential questions that followed her father's death, and in that, you could hear something of Caroline too. Grace died in 1982. Stefano died in 1990. Rainier died in 2005. The losses never really stopped, but Caroline kept standing. Today, at 68, Princess Caroline of Monaco has outlived her mother, her first husband, her great love, and her father. She has endured scandals, widowhood, and a marriage that ended in a psychiatric ward. And still, she shows up. In black, in silence, in duty, Not because she wants to, but because what she has to do has always come before what she wants to do. That was the lesson of her birth, and it has never stopped being the story of her life.